Wednesday, August 27th, 2014. I'm Councilman Mike Bonin, the chair. I'm joined by my colleagues Paul Koretz and Paul Krikorian. There we go, Mr. Koretz. I want to welcome everybody here to the meeting. We'll start, as is my custom, with our multimodal roll call. Over the past couple weeks, who's commuted by bike? By train? Bus? Downtown Dash? In a nod to one of the items on our agenda, anybody use car share lately? Very good. Anybody take a bike or a bus to the Emmys? I thought Eric would have. Kudos to Jimmy Kimmel for taking the Metro and for Tom Smuts from Mad Men from cycling to the Emmys from Santa Monica. Not an easy commute, I assure you. So we are going to get moving on the agenda today. We've got quite a few items today. And colleagues, my recommendation would be, unless there are any objections, to move the following items on consent. The substitute resolutions for item 2 and 3, which make technical corrections to the overhead vehicle restrictions in CD15, as well as items 4, 5, and 6.
Fine. So moved.
Sounds good.
Okay. So we will move forward on or approve all 5 of those items. And a few minutes too early to start the special agenda and dispense with that one. So let's go to the regular agenda and item number 1.
Item number 1 is a communication from the mayor relative to the reappointment of Ms. Marilyn Grunwald to the Board of Taxicab Commissioners for a new term ending June 30th, 2019.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, council members.
Welcome back. It feels like you were
Thank
just here. So you've served about a year?
I'm sorry, sir?
You've served about a year now.
As 9 months, to be exact.
9 months?
Yes.
And what have you learned during that period of time, and why are you interested in continuing?
Oh, I want to continue. We now have a group of new commissioners. Everyone has, over the last year, there was a few changes. So now we have 5 folks, and I hope I will be one of the 5 who will be remaining for some time. And I think a cohesive team will be an excellent idea. And as you probably know, in transportation in general, but also with the Taxi Cab Commission, it's not something you learn in 5 minutes. There's a lot more I need to know, and there's a lot more further we can go with the entire commission. And I look forward to working with President Spiegelman in that capacity.
I should note for the record that we received a letter of support from Commissioner Spiegelman urging your reappointment.
Thank you.
Anything in particular you intend on focusing on during your second term?
Well, obviously, from my little piece of the pie, I'm always interested in access. I am thrilled that I live in a city where more than 10% of our cabs are wheelchair accessible. And I look forward to perhaps being some practical help as we go to 2015 and host the Special Olympics. That will require perhaps more than 10% of our cabs. And also it requires perhaps some sensitivity training, because this is a slightly different group of persons with disabilities. It's not always all about access.
Mm-hmm. I should note, for the record, Mr. Parks has joined us. Colleagues, any of you have questions?
A question. I was just wanted to get your perception. Having sat on this committee for a while, several years ago, we had almost a weekly or monthly discussion about cab drivers at each other's concerns or throats. So they were talking about unionizing a variety of things, and then it kind of settled down. Is that accurate that it's settled down, or is there an undercurrent about?
We have fairly lively commission meetings.
Okay.
And they're very well attended by what looks like a cross-section, well, not gender-wise, unfortunately, but otherwise looks like a cross-section of the cab drivers and the leadership.
What seems to be their issues today? Because I have not seen a lot of them.
I think it's the perennial issues of parking and where the taxi zones are, and they're having a problem with the bandit cabs or Uber or Lyft or whomever you want to call these. And we are trying to work a way around making everybody happy.
Are the issues around LAX pretty well resolved?
I'm sorry?
Issues around LAX. At one time, there was a tension about how cabs were dealt with at LAX.
Yeah, well, that was one of the more interesting things that I learned was the whole culture of having a taxi at LAX and only going there once every 5 days, and we're having all of these facilities just for cab drivers. And yes, there is definitely an issue with people managing to sneak in there and pick up people they shouldn't be. And yeah, that's an ongoing concern.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, hello, Marilyn. Good to see you again.
You too.
I'm glad to see you on this commission. I know you'll be a continuing asset in many ways. One obvious question, though, with the question of access. Are you dealing with or discussing the fact that bandit cabs and ride shares don't provide much
yes,
access?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Have we come up with any kind of solution or hinted a solution to that piece of it?
No, but we will. We will definitely do that. And if any of you have your transportation gurus who have any ideas on that, I'm sure that the President would love to hear them, and I would love to hear them.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've known Commissioner Grunwald for 15 years or so. I think I'm very confident in her abilities.
Yeah, we both have the same color.
She wants to come back and continue to serve the city in this capacity.
Thank you, Councilman.
All right, well, without objection, it will be a unanimous recommendation to the council to reappoint you. Thank you very much for your service.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Next item is item number 7.
Item number 7.
Yes. Before we do so, Mr. Parks has asked to be added as an affirmative vote on the consent items we did earlier.
Thank you.
Okay. Item number 7 is a Labange-Koretz motion directing LADOT in conjunction with the Chief Legislative Analyst and City Attorney to prepare regulations and any authorizations needed for a point-to-point car sharing system.
Excellent. If staff could come on up on this one. I'm also going to call up Walter Rosencrantz, who has a public comment card on this. Let me just start by framing this a little bit, and then I'll ask for public comment and then have staff do their presentation. This is a Labange motion, but it's part of a broader discussion about car share, and I know we'll be having a broader report coming back. We've had a very successful pilot program going for a while with car share here in Los Angeles, and it showed great promise, part of a multimodal network of transportation options that we really need to have here in Los Angeles to get the city moving again. And we've stumbled recently in moving forward on that. We had a deal, we thought we had a good deal with Hertz, and that contract didn't work, and we severed that, and then we directed staff a few months ago to come back to us with some recommendations on how we proceed, both for regular car share and for point-to-point. And I had hoped that we would have had a more thorough and robust set of recommendations from staff by now. We will have one, I hope, in a few weeks. I know the new GM is on it. But this is something that is extremely important for the city to move on. It's something other cities are moving on, and as we build out a network of rail in Los Angeles that's going to be very hard for some people to get to, having car share as part of our first and last mile is going to be extremely important. So before we do the staff presentation, let's hear from Mr. Rosencrantz.
Thank you. My name is Walter Rosencrantz with the car share operator Car2Go. Car2Go is a unique point-to-point car share system operated by the auto manufacturer Daimler. We're operating currently in 29 markets globally. 14 of those are in North America. Some of the global markets include Berlin and Rome. In North America, including DC, Seattle, San Diego. Thank you, members of the committee, for continuing the car share discussion. We've been actively participating in the car share working group with the city and are very excited that the city is looking to implement a comprehensive car share program. We recently launched a program in the South Bay cities of Los Angeles, including Hermosa Beach, Redondo Beach, Lomita, El Segundo, Torrance, and Hawthorne, and are very excited about that program. And every day, our members are asking us when they can use the service in the city of Los Angeles. And we're very excited to be able to provide that service. And additionally, we're in discussions with numerous other cities in LA County. With that, thank you, and I'll be available if you have any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. If staff could go ahead and sort of brief us on where we are now. While we don't have a full set of recommendations or a comprehensive plan before us, I do want to credit staff for having done a lot of outreach and met with some industry leaders. And so if you give us a sense of what kind of work has been going on and what the roadmap is going to be from here.
Sure. So I'll start. Salita Reynolds, General Manager, DOT. And, actually, I was member number 158 of City Car Share when that nonprofit launched in San Francisco. I'm a longtime fan of car sharing and frequent user of it, and am very disappointed that I can't use it in the neighborhood that I moved to in the city of Los Angeles. So my main interest, and I will say also, worked with the team that launched the recommendation to expand car share in the city of San Francisco as well, which was a very large undertaking. It took a lot of staff time to do outreach. The city is just now sort of embarking on it. And I'm familiar with a lot of the research on car sharing, that it enables families to live car light. They may not have to buy that second car, or since we're in Southern California, that third car, and enables them to have a broader spectrum of choices. And that's what we're really interested in doing. So my main interest in the short term is to expand the opportunity for traditional sort of fixed location providers to get access to more spaces in LA. So we have staffing and resource issues that we need to confront that are realities. We're not in a position to do a large-scale rollout immediately, but we are in the position to offer the opportunity for those providers to sort of come to the department and work with us on an expansion of the program that we have now. So that's what we'll be coming back with at the end of September, probably the second meeting in September, with a full recommendation, including the number of spaces we think we can pass each month, and the number of stations, and what the costs will be, the permits, et cetera. As far as the larger rollout, with a more sort of, with a more visionary look at a full-scale sort of ongoing program in the city of Los Angeles, that's something that we want to do correctly, and that we want to do a thorough staffing analysis on. The point-to-point provider is, it took a long time, but it is in San Francisco in sort of a modest way. But there are, there are a lot of unknowns with it, I'll just say, related to enforcement and oversight, and sort of how we want to make sure that we avoid some of the experiences of other communities. Because I think it has a lot of promise. It's something we want to have in the city of Los Angeles, along with a really large rollout, a large program. So our recommendation is that we come back to you at the end of September with the recommendation for an immediate expansion, so that we see more cars out on the street right away, and then come back to you probably sometime after that. We'll commit to a date that we can commit to a timeline that we can keep, with a recommendation for a full-scale program that is, much larger, that includes point-to-point and other things.
So just to be clear, because not everybody has the same level of understanding about car share, it's still foreign to folks. Could you just explain briefly the difference between dedicated space and point-to-point, and why those are two similar but different programs?
So the way traditional, sure, thank you for the question. The way traditional car sharing works, or sort of the first wave of car sharing 1.0, was that, the space exists in a parking lot or on the street. As a member, you reserve that online, you show up, you have a fob, or you have some other way of getting access to the car, you pick up the car, you use it for a certain amount of time, and you bring it back to that same location. So there's a lot of predictability about what that will look like. And so car sharing 2.0, or sort of the next wave, point-to-point, means you pick it up at one of those locations, and you can drop it off at a different one. So it's an A to B instead of an A to A. So you're just doing you're doing a trip instead of a loop with the car. So those are the differences between them.
And so is your thinking that the September recommendations will focus on dedicated space, and the broader analysis coming later will incorporate point-to-point?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
As you think about the first phase, is there any consideration? I'm curious what consideration is being given to, at least at this stage, to what sort of areas would be the most appropriate for dedicated space? The reason I ask is I can imagine there's some areas, downtown, Hollywood and Highland, TOD areas, that it might be appropriate for people who are car light. But, we have a dedicated bus lane in the San Fernando Valley. We have the Crenshaw line and the Expo line that are opening. And I'm wondering if those might also be opportunities where we could be experimenting with it in order to help provide the first last mile.
I'll let staff chime in if you have anything to add, but I would say we want to strike the right balance between, letting those providers, they want to put the cars where they're going to be most used, and they have a vested interest in that. And so we're interested in hearing from them about where they think the demand is highest, and also encouraging that in places where, the demand may not be as robust now, but that we want those cars to be very visible. I mean, that's the benefit of having them in the public right-of-way, is that they're visible. People see them, they wonder about them, they think about them, they investigate them. It's an awareness-raising piece. It's a marketing piece as much as anything else. So we want to strike that right balance, and that's something that we're mindful of when we come back with our recommendations.
And I think just to add to that, we, in the previous effort that we did with CarShare, D. Allen, Department of Transportation, we did look at criteria for having CarShare spots around transit stations, and that was one of the things that we encouraged the proposer to really look at. And as a matter of fact, they were actually doing that on their own outside of the city of LA. So that was one criteria. The other one that we're looking at as well is how do we incorporate green vehicles into this program. And so there are a number of areas that we're looking at as we strike that balance. And also, as you mentioned, there are some areas where the perception is that car share will not be an effective place. And so we wanted to be able to pilot those areas in a smaller way to really sort of see if that is indeed the case. So we're looking at those criteria as we look at it, and then we balance it with sort of the industry needs.
I'm glad you mentioned the green vehicles. I think that's important. I think Mr. Koretz probably would have mentioned that in a second. When you talk about we want to check with the industry about where they think the demand would be greatest, that's a very important consideration. I want to keep in mind two things as we do that, though. One, Mr. Koretz referenced the TCNs a few minutes ago, and while I'm very supportive of that technology, one of my concerns has been sort of an effective redlining of that service, is that it's going to be a lot more popular near the airport or in my district or in Hollywood or downtown than other parts of the city. At the same time, the city in the late 90s negotiated a street furniture contract, and we didn't do a particularly good job in negotiating that. So the company that provided the street furniture in exchange for advertising revenue, they put a lot of stuff that they really wanted to put in my district or in Mr. Koretz's district and in a few other districts, but they weren't as interested in putting it in other parts of town. And so street furniture, transit amenities weren't in all parts of the city equally. So as we think about what works for the companies, I'd also like us to think about how can we make sure that we don't start laying the foundation for sort of a redlining of car sharing service.
Agreed.
Colleagues, any questions?
Let me just, so I'm clear on it, when you were speaking earlier regarding what we're looking in the future, are we looking at one company or multiple companies?
Multiple companies.
It's one of the things I was concerned with, and this is probably one of the disappointments, particularly watching this program grow, that we thought it was as smooth as the pilot went. You just assumed Hertz was going to just take off and put a program together, and then it failed miserably. And so I'm just wondering whether us going forward, looking at multiple companies when we couldn't get one to put together a good program, whether that puts us in a disadvantage of at least piloting a larger effort before just saying let everybody in.
I mean, I can say so that's a good question. I won't speculate as to Hertz's motivations for becoming non-responsive during negotiation, but my understanding of the industry is that it was not because there is a lack of interest or lack of other providers or a lack of an opportunity for success in this market. And, in other cities that have done similar sort of open-ended processes where multiple providers are allowed to come in, the demand and their success has been very robust. These are proven programs, and I think there are really strong proven business models for it.
Okay. And then one point of clarity. Did I understand you say that if you go point to point, you're going from one designated area to another, or do you leave the designated area and you can park it at any other location? It has to go from designated to designated?
So that's my understanding.
Tamara?
At this point, that is something that we are trying to work out what the service areas of the point-to-point would be. It is something that we are currently exploring and hope to come back with when we come back with the further recommendations on that program.
I've read something that we talked about point-to-point. The benefit was you could leave it where you're going as opposed to finding another designated area.
Correct, but we're not quite sure how that would roll out in a city of this size. So we will take it very cautiously, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a better understanding of how that would work as well. So, as an example, you know some likely routes. Obviously, the Expo line right now is stopping at Robertson or La Cienega. There's no good transit way to get to Century City, but presumably a lot of people would take that route. So, with the original plan, you could get to Century City, you could keep that car, you could go to a couple appointments, you eventually come back. If you don't have a need to come back, you just have a need to get there, you could go to presumably places that have been identified like Century City where there's the obvious draw, and you could drop it off in a designated place in Century City, and presumably there will be people wanting to leave Century City and get back to the Expo line. So you'd be, is that essentially the idea? You pick places where there's a lot of demand in both directions.
Yes, that's my understanding of it, but so it creates some issues with what I'll call rebalancing. So say there's a morning commute where everybody comes to one place, gets off the train, they want to get in cars, they want to take those cars downtown or wherever to some employment center or out to the west side, to Santa Monica, whatever. But then it's 10:30 and, there's people showing up at that train station that want to make that same trip and the cars are not available. So that's also an issue. Bike sharing works the same way, and that is something that's part of any vendor's operating contract, is that they drive around in a truck, they load the bikes on, they make sure that the stations are all balanced, so that at any given time, if you show up, there's going to be something available for you. So those are the kind of logistical challenges that make it a little bit less straightforward than a traditional sort of car sharing.
Seems like it would be easier with bicycles. Say you did that right now with the Expo line where it is.
Exactly.
People are coming from Riverside, they take transit to La Cienega, and if there was a bike share established, I don't know if it has been yet, they could bicycle to Santa Monica, somebody could go with a truck and pick up 20 bicycles and move them back to where you wanted them. I'm not sure I see an easy way to do that with cars. So I see that problem. I'm not sure I see an obvious solution that works.
And I think that goes to the point of why we wanted to have a little bit more discussion about how that actually would work and how you want to make sure that the cars are available once you drop it off and they're not left at the spot and nobody comes to get the car. And really, how do you monitor that? And how do you really deal with if you set a service area and then there's a county service area, who's responsible for that car? How long does the car stay in the spot? If you go to one point from A to B and then you drop it off and nobody picks it up, for how long? And so what should be the requirements in the permit to say the car has to be moved within a certain amount of time? So those are some of the logistic things that we are looking at now to come back with more defined recommendations on how we would work that system.
Right.
You know, one thing is, it appears the same problem on rental cars, one-way rental cars, because
Yes.
if I understand it, they actually pay people
Yeah.
to bring them back when you have an overload in one location. So it's on a smaller scale because it's.
And they charge you more if
they
it's a
charge you
one-way
more to
as
drop it
well.
off at another location.
That's right.
But they also have to pay people at time
To come and bring
that
them
fleet
back.
and reorganize it.
And so somebody has to make sure that that's happening,
Exactly.
right, which is the sort of additional resource piece that we just want to get right before we come back with a recommendation.
And these spaces could be at meters as well, so we have to look at that in terms of the number of spaces we are going to allow in a full-blown program, because you're parking, usually it's meter to meter, so we have to look at that as well. And that goes into what a permit cost will be, because it's a permit program. And so how do we calculate that as well?
All of which you'll be putting into your reports
Yeah,
and
so that's-
recommendations. One thing I wonder about, as you and as the car share companies are trying to determine where they might start placing service, is there any sort of equivalent to crowdfunding that they do where they might try to see if there's enough pre-subscribers in a certain given area where a need might be emerging near the Crenshaw line or the Expo line to figure out where to place stuff?
I mean, that's something that we could ask for as part of the permit application.
Yes.
For them to sort of show that they've gone out and done some work around that. And, you know, to your earlier point about geographic, good geographic coverage, we could certainly think about, incentives for providing, certain number of spaces in places that are not typically well-served, for sure.
Mr. Korian, any questions?
Thank you.
All right. So unless there's further questions, we will keep this in committee and look forward to the subsequent reports.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
The next item is item number 9, which is a DOT and Department of City Planning joint report relative to fiscal year 2013-14 milestones for the implementation of the bicycle plan.
No, it's not.
No, it's not.
Item number 8. 8.
Okay. Item 8 is the next item, and that is a Bonin Weezer O'Farrell motion instructing DOT and the Department of City Planning to develop an implementation plan for the city to comply with Senate Bill 743.
All right. I'm also going to ask Noelle Fleming to come up for public comment from Central City Association. And while she does so, let me just sort of frame this issue and why this is in committee. Because I put this on, colleagues, because this is the kind of issue that we can easily not pay attention to, and all of a sudden we feel the impacts, and we wonder, how the hell did this happen? And this is actually a very profound change in how we do traffic analysis and traffic mitigation for developments, something certainly you and I, Mr. Koretz, deal with a lot, as do our colleagues. The state has passed new legislation that will change the way they look at the impacts of traffic changing the very metric that they use for most locations, from level of service, which our DOT staff can explain better than I, to vehicle miles traveled. And not only is the state changing that, but then we will have our own sort of menu of opportunities to figure out how best to apply that here locally. And if we don't think seriously about how to do that, we're going to have some problems. And we've got a short period of time in which to provide comment to the state. So Mr. Weezer and I did this motion. They'll also be having a discussion in Plum Committee, and then we'll ask staff to come back before the comments are made. But Noelle, why don't you make the public comment first, and then we'll hear from staff.
Sure. Noelle Fleming from Central City Association. Thank you, Councilmember Bonin, for your leadership in kind of providing the context. CCA absolutely agrees that this is of critical importance. It's probably right now the number one tool coming up to help change the way that traffic analysis is done under the California Environmental Quality Act. It can truly change the way that projects interact with your local communities in traffic-ridden communities like the West Side, but also emerging TODs like Hollywood and downtown. CCA, we've taken this issue to our members when as soon as the draft guidelines came out. We received, we saw that there was some serious concerns with the draft guidelines as they are written now, not because they are going in the wrong policy direction. I think we all like the policy direction of SB 743, but of critical importance is how much certainty they provide. If there is a lack of certainty, it's going to greatly impact the city's ability to defend environmental analysis for its community plans, but also for individual projects. So I just wanted to express that on the record. We will be coming up with a detailed letter with our comments, and we're looking forward to the continued discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Who's going to take the lead, Jay or Claire?
Yes. Good afternoon, Mr. Bonin, council members. Jay Kim from DOT. You're right. This is a fundamental change in how we do traffic impacts analysis under CEQA. For years, even we have struggled with dealing with level of service, mainly because the city's kind of already built out. And so we've been chasing these vanishing capacity improvements that sort of LOS sort of naturally lends itself to. The current law, as proposed, will actually...
Before you do that, explain what metric level of service...
Okay, the level of service is actually looking at the roadway capacity to handle how many vehicles you can actually process through an intersection. So if you have 100% capacity, then we kind of, just like in school, right, you might be at an F if you're over that capacity. If you're at 90%, you might be at a, like an E and, and down. And so it's just a grading system just to kind of measure your demand against what available capacity that you do have. So it's very car-centric in that it only sort of concerns itself with the movement of vehicles.
And that kind of metric tends to lend itself then to traffic mitigations like road widenings that may actually reduce the size of a sidewalk and make an area less pedestrian friendly.
Right, and that's kind of been the conflict. So the criticism was that it perpetuates sort of the car attachment. And also, recently we've had lots of changes in policies that really wanted to improve the ped, bike, and transit experience. So you have that policy, but when you're using the LOS metric, a lot of times it would come at odds because you're trying to mitigate that metric by widening the roadway at the expense of having, let's say, wider sidewalk to provide a sense of place or outdoor dining. And so those things were coming at odds. So I think this is a very timely legislation. We've also been struggling internally. And actually we look forward to these changes because with the proposed new metric of the vehicle miles traveled, and that's actually by measuring the number of trips that are generated by a project, multiplying by the distance they travel to kind of get a sense of, it's kind of a proxy for, I guess, the generation of greenhouse gases also, right? And that was the intent of many of the previous legislations that were passed, like AB 32. So this is all sort of tying into all of that. So moving forward with the VMT metric, by the nature of that metric, your goal is to actually reduce the VMT. And so by that built-in nature, you're no longer pursuing physical roadway widening, capacity enhancing improvements. Actually, you're more concerned with changing people's behavior, perhaps, getting more people into active transportation mode or into transit or telecommuting. Basically, it just screams transportation demand management.
So presumably, under this metric, a Target superstore would have a hell of a lot bigger vehicle miles traveled than a mom-and-pop neighborhood supermarket.
Yes. Once you have a regional trip attracting project, then because the distances are farther, it will have a higher VMT profile. And we also have Claire Bowen from the planning department.
I was just going to clarify that a regional destination just in and of itself, though, wouldn't necessarily have a larger VMT, because a lot of what we're going to be doing is analyzing not only the size of a project and the scope of the project in terms of the kinds of uses that are there, but also where the project is located. So a Target that comes into the downtown, because there is more transit opportunities, might have a lower VMT than that same size Target placed in the northern part of the valley that doesn't have. So those are kind of the nuances that we're going to be figuring out in terms of how we actually then calculate out a project's VMT in the future. And I think that really speaks to some of Noel's questions about certainty. And so we know as we partner up over the next few months to figure out actually how to implement SB 743, one of our challenges as a city is going to be to figure out how do we put in place a process that really creates certainty for developers so they know what is it that we are going to use to measure their project's VMT, and then what are the different things they might be able to do to lower their VMT should it come out higher, and what are the thresholds that we're going to use to form the basis of whether it's a project significant or not.
So the Governor's Office of Planning and Research has put out sort of a draft, and it's up to local jurisdictions to comment on that.
Yes.
First question is this proposed to be a universal standard for a new metric for all developments, or just in certain areas?
Right now, as proposed, it's within the transit priority area, defined as half a mile within a major transit stop or a high-quality transit corridor. I believe we have mapped what that would look like, and it covers most of the city of LA.
It's David Summers from Department of City Planning. One thing I'd like to add is that it actually has a phased implementation behind the legislation. So what's captured actually under the motion, this January 2016 date, is actually the second phase of implementation. The first is that this VMT metric would replace level of service in areas defined as transit priority areas and fill projects in those areas. We would map that within the city what those defined geographies would be. That would take effect when this when this goes forward, this rulemaking process concludes with the enrollment with the Secretary of State, which is estimated sometime to be within early 2015. We would, as a lead agency, have 4 months period to adjust to be able to incorporate that within our CEQA process. The second implementation phase is this timeline that was in the motion, January 2016. This rule takes effect statewide, meaning that level of service will no longer be a metric of evaluation within CEQA in any geography, and that the replacement metric would be the applicable methodology under CEQA.
There's so many things to think about with this. Is the state asking us if we think this is good or bad? Is the state asking us how we should measure the new metric? Is the state asking us how we should measure after the fact whether or not that evaluation was correct? Is the state asking us to decide now what the proper mitigation should be for traffic impacts with this new metric? Any of those or all of the above?
I think it's all of the above, all those questions. I mean, they've recommended, obviously, certain things moving forward as part of their discussion draft. And they have considered alternative measurement tools, but they're leaning towards the VMT right now. And all the questions you've asked about all those other related questions, yes, those are things that we do have to begin to actually evaluate. The tools, for example. There are simple, low-cost spreadsheet tools to very complex, very labor-intensive modeling tools. Given sort of the budgetary constraints of the city and timing issues, resource constraints, we have to evaluate a lot of these tools. Some are free. Again, some are very expensive. Some may not stand up to the legal challenges as better than others. So we're actually going through the exercise of beginning to evaluate those readily available tools that are out there today.
Who's going to determine what the City of LA's tools are to measure when a project is submitted to the Planning Department for approval? DOT looks at it. Who's going to determine what tools we use to predict what the traffic impact or the VMT will be?
Are you asking whether it would be DOT or planning?
Will it be the state, or will we, as the council?
No, the city as a lead agency, you're given the latitude to decide on a tool to set the definition of what a significant impact is, the threshold, and then you will have your process of analyzing a project under those rules. And when you determine a project to have a significant impact, then you would propose certain kinds of mitigations, that will declare that it's been mitigated. So the process is very similar to the old method. I don't think the general CEQA provisions do not change. It's just that you're using a brand new metric, and so it has different implications on the outcome.
If sort of a preferred traffic mitigation of LOS is a street widening, as an example, what are some likely preferred mitigations of traffic impacts using a VMT system?
I could already foresee contributing towards first and last mile solutions, right? We talk about getting more people out of cars. If we're making the measure our investment, but we have these major gaps where people can't get to those stations, here's an opportunity where a developer come in and their mitigation could be contribution or the implementation of bike share, car share, or other programs that could kind of bridge that gap. They can do free transit passes. They can do carpool. Maybe not carpool, that's a bad example. They can do other kinds of traditional TDMs. They could even institute telecommuting, for example, right? Anything that will actually reduce the overall number of car trips coming to the site, they can pursue all those things. They could even contribute towards transit seating capacity, help to improve our system, right? Our transit system, bike facilities, pedestrian, amenities. So all these things kind of help to create a different city infrastructure moving forward. And so I think it's a great opportunity for us to kind of fashion some of our rules so that we do channel those kinds of right mitigations towards the things that we want to see as part of our general plan, as part of the mobility element, as part of our general goal to get around the city in a different fashion.
Claire Bowen, City Planning. I was just going to add that obviously you've identified a lot of kind of technical processes and procedures that we're going to have to kind of evaluate to kind of figure out what is the process we're going to put in place. And we have been fortunate to receive a grant from the Strategic Growth Council to actually allow the city to hire on a consultant to help us make some of these initial steps and do some of this initial analysis.
Colleagues?
I have to admit I'm still a little bit confused about this legislation. What's the goal of the change? What's the legislative purpose for doing this? What are they looking to accomplish in this change?
I think that one of the biggest things they want to mention, I mean, they want to change, as Jay was mentioning earlier, that the LOS model we use today doesn't accurately reflect kind of all the changes we're looking to try to make within our modal system. It really helps just continue to promote us as a vehicular mode of transportation, and moving more to a VMT really helps us acknowledge the impacts of vehicular movement on pedestrians and bicyclists in transit.
I would like to add that, I mean, if you read the current proposal, I mean, they clearly state that the objective is really to reduce the greenhouse gases, provide multimodal transportation options, as well as diversity of land use, because that's the other part of it. You earlier mentioned, well, what can they pursue as a developer to mitigate? You could build the right kind of project in the right kind of location, and that will be your mitigation, actually, right? Because if you think about it, if you have a building, an office project proposal, and you built it next to a transit center, you're probably going to generate less vehicular trips. And again, you're almost kind of walking in with a built-in mitigation. So I think this legislation could help the city actually better plan and better have certain development projects show up at the right locations. That's the other sort of benefit that I see coming forward.
So let me use an example, a real-life example that we were dealing with, and I think it's still in court in the final stages, the Kasdan project at Pico and Sepulveda. Project right at the location of one of the primary stops on the Expo line once it's built. The original proposal, several hundred housing units and big box retail that would generate people driving to it from around the region. Ultimately, in negotiating with the neighbors, etc., the retail was removed from it. So it went down from 12,000 trips to 3,000 trips, and it's essentially just a housing project within easy walking distance of the Expo line. Would removing those car trips and the retail constitute the kind of mitigation they were looking for? So just by building housing right next to the Expo line, would that now be what they were looking for? Or are there other things they'd be looking for? Would that be more or less of what they wanted?
You want to take this?
You can start.
All right. It really depends. I think this is going to be an interesting exercise for us in refining our tools as far as how we evaluate land use projects. But I think that's where the opportunities are. I think it really depends if that big box retail, what the trip generation characteristics would really be. If you're thinking about it from a mixed use land use scenario where you have residential and retail, and that by substantial data that shows those trip characteristics are really internal capturing, that retail would be drawing from a local service area, could perhaps be a replacement from a similar use that's further distant. Perhaps people in those neighborhoods are already using those commercial services, but having to go an extra 4 or 5 miles to access those. Under this framework, this could actually show somewhat of a benefit to vehicle miles traveled. But at the same token, if it's a big box characteristic that's actually creating a regional draw that's replacing trips that are being made elsewhere, that could potentially create a scenario where that would exceed a VMT performance criteria that we would be setting, that we'd be looking at. And then a lot of it depends on how the city itself defines this target. That will be a critical aspect of this exercise.
Well, the answer is I have no idea whether I got no greater clarity from the answer to the question. So I don't know whether doing what we did, which is cutting out all the retail, which I believe is a regional draw, and would have generated I think 9,000 trips that we estimated. Whether the preference would be to do that, or the preference would be to have the whole 12,000 trips and give the residents free Expo line passes. I mean, I don't have even the remotest sense of where this goes.
I think, Claire Bone again from City Planning, I think that what we're hoping to do with this new methodology is expand the kind of tools we have on looking at a project. So when we did the Casden project at Sepulveda, the only tool we had was kind of our traditional way of evaluating projects. And so the way we look at trip generation rates today is based on kind of a nationwide standard that typically uses suburban rates. So we kind of made an assumption about what the trip generation rates would be for that project. And so looking at those old models, it says that that's going to generate 9,000. But that trip generation rate doesn't take into consideration, in this case, the specifics of that location, that it's going to be at a transit center. And so what we want to do with the funding that we're getting from the state is to be able to go in and look at really in the region of Los Angeles, in the city of Los Angeles, when you have that type of retail or regional generator at a transit station, are the trip generation rates what we're finding nationwide in suburbia, or are they something more akin to Manhattan, or are they something in between? So what we want to do is we'd go through rigorous analysis to really figure out what are the trip generation rates of different types of projects. Like we know, for example, that an affordable housing project is typically going to generate lower trip generation rates than a market rate. But again, today, when we look at trip generation rates, we just will put them all in the same bucket. So we want to have a greater set of tools so that you as decision makers going forward in the future, when you have that same kind of project, would have more nuanced information than we had when we did the Casden project.
A little bit of an idea. Okay. I get it. So you try to get more of a handle on how many trips really are generated and how many trips are just replaced, whether people would be otherwise driving 10 miles to a Target further out, or whether they would be making that trip instead of going to a store 2 blocks away.
Right. We want to understand some of the more particular characteristics of the local area. Yes.
Well, you've got a lot of work to do, and I'm looking forward to this coming back. There's a lot about this that is exciting. The idea that we are making greenhouse gas emissions a bigger concern, the idea that there could be metrics and mitigations that prioritize the quality of a neighborhood over the number of vehicles that can speed through it are good things. But I can tell that there's a lot of folks in this room, myself included, who can get excited about that, who get stars in their eyes. And I'm very afraid that in our enthusiasm to move towards that metric and towards that new standard and towards those new mitigations, we might unwittingly become blind to the risks and the perils from this change if it's not done right. Developers are going to look at this with a lot more time and a lot more land use lawyers than many neighborhoods are. And I think we need to be very careful that we're looking out for our neighborhoods and we figure out how to do this. There's ways in which this could be very beneficial, and then there's ways in which this could be, the next SB 1818, where we pass something and then we find out 8 years later, man, there's some really bad consequences, and it's a hell of a time to try to fix them. So I want to be watching this very carefully, and I'd encourage you before the comment period is up and before we submit anything that you actually visit with the planning deputy in each council office so that they're aware of this. I kind of got aware of this. I'm sure my staff would have brought it to my attention, but because I was sort of insistent on the fact that traffic mitigations, in most cases, I don't think work in my district, so I was always pressing, how can we do this better? But I think there's a lot of folks still not aware of this, and if you could engage them now, because different parts of the city will have different thoughts and different perspectives on what this will mean.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move this forward to council. Which will give you then, once Plum Committee and this moves to council will then direct you to do the report and come back.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now we go to item number 9, which is a DOT and city planning report, joint report relative to fiscal year 2013-14 milestones for the implementation of the bike plan.
Hello. Before you get started, I'm trying to remember to do public comment at the beginning this month. Dennis Heineman.
Hi, my name is Dennis Hyman. The DOT has done a remarkable job of implementing the amount of bike lanes. Unfortunately, they've been taking the opportunity to put them where the space has been available, which is tend to be the lower population density areas. And another thing that we should look at as far as mixed-use path or a bike way is using as a tool to spur development. And if you look at the Indianapolis Cultural Trail, that's exactly what they did. They didn't use it as a transportation. They didn't develop it and market it as a transportation tool. They used it to spur development in the area. An interesting point of opportunity of putting in bike lanes is Wilmington, where they have 8 major streets on the bike plan. Obviously, those would be the streets you would put bike lanes, but they have 24 streets now with bike lanes. Again, I've emphasized that before. That's a good opportunity to see what happens when you put a fine-grained network of bike lanes in. How would that affect increasing the amount of bicycling in an area? Also, transportation is the second biggest household cost. So lowering the cost by using bicycling obviously is a good tool to make it more desirable to live in the city. So the emphasis, obviously there's a trade-off, is trying to get bicycling in the high-density population areas. So obviously space is a premium there, but you can't just put bicycling on residential. You have to take some of the arterial street in order to make a network. So that's something to work with.
Thank you, Dennis. Michelle.
Michelle Mallory, Senior Bicycle Coordinator with LADOT.
David Summers, Department of City Planning.
So we're back before you. Last time we were here, we gave you a verbal report of where we were on the bicycle plan. You asked us to address a number of issues. We've come back to you with a rather lengthy staff report. You can thank our general manager for taking a few pages out of it. But we think we've answered your questions, and we're going to entertain more today, I'm sure.
Thanks. Just sort of as a general overview, how well are we doing on implementation, if you're going to give us a letter grade?
We're doing well in some things. We're not doing well in others. Mr. Heineman just talked about the things that we're not doing well, some of the things we're not doing well, and he's right. In some of the more dense areas of the city, we've had difficulty getting bike lanes in. The bicycle planning...
So tell me first what we're doing well. Let's start with the good news.
We've done a good job at parking. We've done a good job at launching new things like the bicycle-friendly business district and the bike corrals and the bike repair stations. All that stuff is up and moving, and we're having good success with that and getting good buy-in on that. We need more staff. We're doing okay on money, not great on money, but okay. But what we've been able to get grant funds to be able to do things we need to do. We are having difficulty delivering some of those things because of the lack of staffing. So those things we're doing pretty well. And sometimes I wish we were less successful at getting money. It's pretty difficult to get some of the things on the ground. We are having difficulty getting bicycle lanes in very dense areas. The bike plan called for a 5-year strategy of essentially a mid-city in South LA filling in of the grid. And those are the year 1, year 2, year 5 things that we've been working on. We've had some difficulty getting those facilities on the ground. David? What am I forgetting?
Well, yeah, I would just like to highlight, that we have been successful in some specific corridors implementing on the backbone network in some of the dense areas of the city. Downtown network, I think, has been almost completely built out. And there were some great momentum that I think we took advantage of at the adoption of the bicycle plan. We were able to install a fairly extensive road diet on Colorado Boulevard, and there was several others that were fairly high-profile, good projects, road that were also really safety, enhance the safety of those corridors, and also the feeling of comfort. And this was indicated in the report, and I'd just like to highlight that some of those efforts were also due to a lot of involvement and support within the local community. Colorado Boulevard was supported by the Eagle Rock Neighborhood Council, and also was supported by many of the businesses that are along the corridor that really understood that transforming a corridor to be locally serving rather than just a cut through to go to and back from two adjacent cities is really something that's in their best interest. And so, we got strong positive feedback from them, and the council office was also played a very good supportive role in that effort, hosting community meetings. The My Figueroa Streetscape project, the mayor's office and the council office is involved in that. Played a really great role in facilitating a conversation around some people that were just worried about what a project of that scale and magnitude would do to that corridor, but we were able to, evolve into those discussions specific task items for staff that we could go back to and include these stakeholders throughout the implementation process. So, we have them involved in a new effort as far as programming special events along the corridor. They're involved in our effort as far as defining what the transportation, what the overall metrics should be as far as defining success. That's in terms of safety. That's in terms of access. Creating a lot of opportunities for people to get to specific businesses. Just creating a sense of place. So we're looking at we're going to be exploring sales tax data along the corridor as a result of that effort. So this is all really in line, I think, with some of the other cities that have really seen success, where we have really defined clear set of goals at the outcome, involve the community in defining those goals, and able to establish some of the measures which we're going to be measuring success. So that's part of the effort, I think, that we're should be highlighted as far as and look to perhaps as a model as how we proceed.
Let me hit a couple stats. We approved this in 2010, right? The 5-year implementation strategy included 200 miles of bikeways every 5 years. That's an average of 40 per year. We hit that, right?
We did, but we didn't necessarily implement the projects that were within that 40-mile, within the 200 mile.
I know, I'm getting there. I'm trying to underscore some of the good stuff here.
Okay.
The city of Los Angeles has historically done a very poor job telling its good stories. So I want to tease out a little of it. So our goal was 40 miles a year. Our average is about 41.2 miles of bikeways per year. So that's good. We installed half of the proposed bike lanes and bike paths in the 2010 plan, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, to make you happy, the bad part is that we won't...
It doesn't make me happy, but I want the system built out.
We've only done a very small fraction of the bicycle-friendly streets, right?
Correct.
We've done about 44%, I see, of our backbone network.
Yes.
About 40% of our green network.
Yes.
And hardly anything of our neighborhood network.
Correct.
Okay.
And yes.
So why is that? What are the particular challenges with the neighborhood network? Is it more community opposition? Is it due to sort of the logistics? Is it due to funding? Is it due to staffing?
Funding, staffing are probably higher priorities. The neighborhood network requires civil design. It's more like building a bicycle path than it is like striping a bicycle lane. Striping a bicycle lane is relatively cheap and relatively simple design. It's a simple street plan. So if we're resurfacing or changing stuff, it's relatively easy to redo a street striping plan. With this, we have to find the right money, make sure we have the right opportunities, do the right outreach, which we haven't done with a lot of communities yet, and get those projects on the ground. That said, The Safe Routes to School, Active Transportation Plan Safe Routes to School project, we've just gotten a big chunk of money. We're being promised a big chunk of money from the state that are bike-friendly streets that affect schools. So we have some monies to do some things. We need to do more.
Okay. Item 1 in your report talks about the national rise of protected bike lanes.
Yes.
But if I look at the list of the bike lane projects under study for fiscal year 14-15, there's no mentions of plans for protected bikeways, which will speak to the next item on the agenda, which is about metrics. Are you guys looking at pursuing any protected bike lane projects in this fiscal year?
So SMyFig is a protected bike lane project. A cycle track, the language is unclear nationally. Nobody's using the same terms yet, but MyFig is certainly one of those. We are also looking at Los Angeles Street right now. We believe we will have that on the ground within this next fiscal year. The other item, and maybe David wants to hit on this, is where we're going with the mobility element. And the Bicycle Enhanced Network is a low-stress network, primarily of cycle track, protected bike lane type facilities.
Okay, and
Second Street Tunnel, sorry.
For the bicycle-friendly streets, what's on the horizon for this fiscal year?
And I'm going to forget all of these. The Safe Routes to School applications. Berendo Middle School has 11th Street. We have another Safe Routes to School application. These are all a couple of years old that we've just started progress on. New Hampshire, which actually crosses 11th Street in the Pico Union area and heads north. We have one on Pierce Street in Pacoima. So those are all the projects that will be in design on within the next fiscal year, and then the new ATP projects will be added to the queue of those lists, and there are 4 of those.
So you said we've done well getting money.
We have.
Section 6 of the report, program funding, applications and awards, says that we've been doing a good job. You're right.
Yes.
But Section 3 of the report on implementation says we're doing a much better job at getting money than we are at building out the stuff that we get the money for. And maybe this is a question that Ms. Reynolds should chime in on, although she's still new, is how do we fix that?
I will say that when you talk about the bike-friendly streets and these ATP applications, what we're doing with Safe Routes, it's not just the project management staffing that we need within DOT to keep the money moving. We also need to work with the Bureau of Engineering and the Bureau of Street Services on those designs, and we need them to be staffed up to do this work for us as well.
Yeah, and I would just comment that typically, anything you're doing with paint, you're right. From a capital perspective, it's not as expensive, but from a time and process and even analysis and environmental review perspective, it is expensive. It costs a lot of time, and it costs a lot of, that is person time. Those are person hours spent out in the field doing a lot of very intense outreach. My perspective on it is that we should be very responsible and strategic about how much money we're going to pursue in sort of light of the resource realities that we face. I would much rather take money, execute, and deliver projects with the staff that we have than go out and try and claim every dollar that's on the table and then get in the doghouse with our funders because we miss deadlines and can't deliver, and then we miss out on funding down the road. Because the trend is that there's only going to be more money for these types of improvements, not less. And so we want to be, the best at project delivery so that we can continue to sort of build on that success and get more funding down the line. I think that there is a real opportunity to put the right resources in this team and also to be intelligent about how we use our bench of consultants when it's appropriate. I think we need to get that balance right because in order to attract the best, brightest folks to work for the City of Los Angeles, those folks want to do the work. And so we need to find the right balance of staff and consultants to really deliver and move ahead. I would also say we need to think about different outreach models. So there is a model where you do an extensive period of community outreach where the community is really empowered to design the project. And the outcome you get is going to be as good as your process was. And there's another approach where you pilot something on the street, and those are not tailor-made for grants. That's the department putting our money where our mouth is, taking a risk, piloting something, and coming back to the community and providing evaluation, analysis, and committing to tinkering with things and taking it out if it doesn't work. That's a much faster path to delivery, but the risks are higher, and you can't do that everywhere.
Does Great Streets present an opportunity to do that in some places?
Absolutely. And, that word pilot has implications from an environmental perspective, so we need to be really smart and stay within the limits that we are given. But there are tremendous opportunities for that, and tremendous opportunities to go out and say, these are the designs we'd like to try, here is what we're going to evaluate, here is when we're going to come back to you, here is our commitment to work with you if things don't turn out the way that are that we anticipate.
I should also mention, Salita's jog my memory here, and the LACBC folks behind me will kill me if I don't mention our partnership on a HEAL grant, Healthy Eating, Active Living, for an Active Streets LA. We did a number of outreach, just as you're suggesting, where the community basically pointed out where the problems. We talked about design options and solutions, and we have been being awarded almost $1.3 million to do another bike-friendly street in South LA.
Okay. Correct?
Yeah, just one question. Looking at our current budget, is there adequate funding for the implementation team to do all this? And if we're short, how short are we? Does that make this less practical?
I would say no, that we do not have enough bodies budgeted on our team.
Right. I think that's correct. I couldn't tell you how short we are, and at the beginning of our process to understand what's our carry forward obligation, how much backlog do we have on the books right now to keep current staff busy, and do we need budgeted positions, or can we get positions hired to against those grants that we currently have in hand? I think there's a mismatch there. I think that there's an imbalance. But we need that steady level of staffing to go out, pursue the grants, and deliver on them. So there's some level of staffing, minimum level of staffing that we need to be consistent in order to continue to make good on our promise to deliver these projects.
Well, when will we know if we're so short that we don't have the staff to go out and get the grants to?
We're there right now.
Yeah.
We're absolutely there right now. It will be very difficult for us to apply for Call for Projects money and ATP money next year.
Even with the resources that were allocated in the budget for this year, which may not yet be filled, but once those are filled...
If we are, and I should introduce Rabina Gazarian, who is our new bicycle coordinator, who's in the audience behind us. She's brand new. We've got one new replacement, and she started on Monday, so she's a week behind Salita. If we are able to backfill all of our engineering positions on the bike team and fill some of the new ones that are budgeted, and as well as in the PED team, we will be able to apply for money again. But we do need to be able to work with the bench and our partners in BOE and BSS to be able to deliver.
So is the problem funding in the budget? Is it managed hiring and actually getting people hired with the money that's already budgeted?
Who wants to touch this?
And as you introduce this, Mr. Hirano, I think what Michelle just said about our potential inability to be able to apply for the ATP call, that would be a remarkable embarrassment for the mayor as chair of Metro to have his own city unable to do that. So that's my way of prefacing it, the question, which is, what are you going to do to fix this?
Correct, and both of you have asked questions that are actually very timely. Working together with the CLA and the mayor on SCPOC, we've also identified this as a critical area to fix. And it's not just DOT staff that are needed to complete these projects, but street services staff, and some instances engineering staff in the Bureau of Engineering. So our biggest focus most recently has been trying to work through the managed hiring process and trying to work within the city budget to get the ability for these three agencies to hire and to hire up to the limits that are established in the budget. Now, beyond that, DOT has been proactively trying to, for the first time ever, really go through and quantify the amount of work that they have already awarded to them through their grant projects. And I think my understanding is that they're getting very close to having that work done. That's critical because then they can communicate back to our office and the CLA and the mayor and to all of you exactly how much work they have and how many resources will be needed to bring to the table to actually complete these projects in a timely manner. We've never actually had that information before. It's a critical piece that's been lacking, and we're looking forward to seeing that so that we can have a real good sense as to what it is we need to do to actually keep faith with our grantors, get these jobs, local jobs created, get the projects in the ground, and do everything that we all want to do.
I would just say for the record, once again, that I'm no longer a fan of our managed hiring process, and I think this is just one more example of where I think it's more of an impediment than it is a help to the city.
Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. President. Mr. Park, Mr. Krikorian? Okay.
I had a couple of things. One of the things, and having watched the managed hiring, and it gets blasted a number of times, I think if people were here when every department in the city were over budget on their own, they would probably have a different view of managed hiring. And then they'd have a different view when they went through the process of putting hard freezes, which didn't allow general managers to do anything. But I think what we found out since managed hiring has been in place, there's an equal responsibility of managed hiring and whether personnel has the positions opened or whether they have done the testing to allow you to hire. So there's a hiring process that slows down. There's a managed hiring trying to save the budget so that Mr. Krikorian can sweep somewhere around March and have money for next year. The other thing is that the issue also comes in that more often than not, we find general managers not knowing they have gotten positions cleared and yet they still not filled them. So there's three parts to the puzzle. Do you know the positions are open? Have you made an attempt to fill them? Does personnel department have your authorities to where the testing has gone on and positions and lists are available? And then thirdly, have we gone through the process and gotten them cleared? Without going through those three levels, you can't just grab managed hiring and saying it's the problem, because we also find there's two other parts of the puzzle that are more often than not a larger problem.
Okay, so with that, we'll receive and file the report. Thank you for preparing it. We will be having at a subsequent meeting at some point a discussion, I think in September, about the filling of the vacant positions. And I'm going to ask for continued dialogue with the department over improving its implementation and the managed hiring issue. I'd also ask if you could just provide to us, just informally, a schedule for the delivery of our grant-funded projects. And in future reports, Michelle, if we can have not just a list of bikeway projects, but maybe colored maps so we can actually see. Yeah. Appreciate that. Thank you. Okay. We have one item left on the regular agenda, but the special agenda item, I think, is a consent item, unless folks have an objection.
I just have
on the special?
On the special.
Okay.
If we could have staff, I just need...
Yeah, let's adjourn the regular, convene the special. We're now in the special.
That's item number 1 on the special, which is the CAO report relative to 2 LADOT contracts with Shelter Clean Services for management, maintenance, landscaping services for 11 bike path facilities and 7 city transit facilities.
I just have one request. What we see, and I think when we've gone to vendors to do the medians and things of that nature, they've done a good job. There's 2 areas that they often fail. One, being in process for a couple of years, they generally rake away all of the shrubbery and the grass. So at the end of their contract, they have very little to maintain. They never replace it as they tear it down. The other thing, their tendency is they cut the sprinkler heads off, and then you can't get the area with sufficient water, and they don't replace them unless you go through some arm wrestling. So I don't know if it's in the contract, but it would appear in our interest that we should have, as part of the shrubbery and the maintenance of those medians and places where there is shrubbery, that if they tear it out, they should replace it, and they should also maintain the sprinkler heads or what other irrigation that might get damaged during the life of the contract. So those are, I don't know if it's in the contract, but those are things that we see routinely that get ignored, and then they'll come out and they'll rake dirt. The flowers are gone, the shrubbery's gone, and they'll rake dirt and keep getting their check. The dilemma is, do they replace the shrubbery when it disappears? So those are two things I'd like to see. If it's not in the contract, that we find a way that anytime we do one of these, that you ensure that they have a responsibility to replace the damage that's done while they're maintaining the area.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Felicia Roscoe with the Office of the CAO. I do believe those would count as the as-needed variable costs, but I'm not sure as the process of how that would go
I don't think they
about.
realize it's their job, and I think that may be one of the problems that we need to make sure they know, that they should be replacing sprinklers and shrubbery when they're destroyed. And at some point, common sense should kick in. If you're raking dirt, there's very little to be out there maintaining.
Councilmember David Haran with the CAO's office. Those are actually very insightful and important comments. Like an opportunity to go back and talk to the department, work through those subjects just raised, to make sure that the contract is structured in a way that addresses your concerns. So,
And if we do, that happens not only on transportation, but just medians that all those contracts should have something in there that says you repair your damage.
correct. So if the committee wouldn't mind, why don't you let our office and DOT go back and consider this, and then come back on this side. Okay.
Thank you.
That satisfy everything?
That's fine.
All right.
Okay.
And we'll approve this item? We'll approve the item.
Okay. David, did you want this back in committee for a follow-up on Mr. Parks' request? Or
Do it while it's going to council?
We could do that between now and the time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Approved.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that will conclude the special, which we will now adjourn, and we will reconvene into the regular. And item 10.
Item 10 is a budget recommendation instructing LADOT to report relative to using connectivity and safety as metrics instead of bike lanes for building the citywide bicycle master plan.
Okay, Michelle and David, if you want to come back up. I'll make this one brief. Sometimes I feel like I'm crossing the line and subjecting you to a sort of mini APTA conference in these meetings. So we'll try to make this one brief, since it's a direction to come back and do more. This item came about as a result of discussions in this year's budget committee. In the process leading up to the development of this year's budget, the mayor's office shepherded a number of teams involving city departments and council offices in trying to come up with a more performance-based budget. Central to that discussion was the idea that we need to have metrics for our various departments and our various programs. When we were discussing DOT and active transportation during the budget process, I thought it would be useful for the department, and even more useful now that we have a new general manager, to give some thought and to share it with the committee and the policymakers early on, before the budget gets started, on what the relevant metrics for the department should be. And I asked specifically to look at the bicycle plan as a way to do metrics. And the reason I did that is I thought it would be very easy for us to have a great metric that didn't have a lot of impact. It would be very easy for us to put sharrows everywhere and say that we have had a great success with the bicycle master plan, and that perhaps better metrics are safety or connectivity or an increase in bicycle commuting in the city of Los Angeles. So this doesn't need to be a big discussion today. It was really a direction to the department to begin working on the suggested proper metrics and come back to committee. But I just sort of want to lay that out there, see if you have any thoughts, and if there's any thoughts from my colleagues before you begin work.
So there is one, Michelle Mallory, Senior Bicycle Coordinator with LADOT, there is one metric that we're using that actually does do some of the things you want to do. We call it the Bicycle Network Score. One of our really outstanding students who got snapped up by a consultant now works in D.C. It is essentially a small model that looks at the overall mileage in the plan and is GIS-based and looks at the map of what we would implement and factors in things like density, car ownership, I'm trying to think what else is, housing, connectedness to the rest of the facility. There's a weighting for the type of facility we put in, so a Shero gets a very small score as opposed to a bicycle path or a cycle track. And it gives us a score based on overall build out to the overall plan, but it also gives each node that we would look at to put in, we could determine its value to the overall system. So if we wanted to look at a corridor in the west side versus a corridor in the valley, we could score each of those. It's a great tool. We need better staffing to be able to do it. We've got a student now who's trained and we're using that, and we're trying to get a computer in-house that has enough muscle to run the program on a regular basis. The other thing that I've been thinking about doing, and I haven't had a chance to discuss this with David, but one of the things we do for the feds when we apply for highway safety improvement money is a cost-benefit ratio that's based on safety. So you look at the number of collisions in the corridor, how much the project costs, and it gives you a number for safety. We might look at that and see if we can develop something that measures safety for each of the segment as well and return to you with something like that. We absolutely need to look at counts as well. That we need to work more with the Bike Coalition, do a better job at counting.
Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that we weight Sheros differently. I'm kind of wondering if anyone's actually ever studied their effectiveness and whether it actually reduces the number of accidents or increases the number of people using. Because certainly, as an example, I, as a very timid cyclist, I'll ride in a bike path. A Shero doesn't really attract me because it just means you're giving a little warning to the cars, but you're still in the same, less safe situation where you're competing with them.
So we have actually done a study of Sheros and their effectiveness. I think you're absolutely right. For a cyclist that's uncomfortable in sharing the lane, it's not a great improvement for them. We do know they do have some effectiveness, and we know that in areas where we put the Shero in, it's funny David had this today, but in an area that we put the Shero in, we actually do see a little bit of improvement by the motorists in backing off and less aggressive behavior. We'll give you David's copy and I'll get him a new one. But we have done a little bit of analysis on how the Shero works. The first analysis of the shared lane marking, or Shero, was actually done by the city of San Francisco when they first presented the marking to the state for adoption, and they looked at positioning, that the marking showed cyclists where better to position themselves, and it did have some success in getting some cyclists off of the sidewalks.
If I could just add, David Summers from Department of City Planning. I don't think I could leave without actually making a plug for the mobility plan and how this actually tees up really nicely with how we'd like to be evaluating the facilities in the future and how that sinks in. I mean, there's this really terrific opportunity here to really sink that also in with the budget, with the budgeting process. I mean, I think the only things that really need to be fully explored and considered is the timing and frequency that we could pull this data, our capacities. The crash statistics are fairly readily available from the Los Angeles Department of the Police Department. I think we could be coordinating with them if getting the data available instead of having to go to the state for the data that they already submit to them. So I think that there's just some coordination efforts that need to be probably handled. But otherwise, I think this is a really meaningful approach to how we implement our bicycle facilities, and we'll really be able to demonstrate and clearly articulate, I think, the success that we going forward.
How many days?
Anybody else? Okay, so the direction will be to go forth and come back with some draft new metrics. I'd also ask, sort of in connection with this, when we come back, maybe in, say, 90 days, if Salita could also give us a bit of, in connection to this, a report on sort of the state and the status of bike design and sort of what some of the best practices are. All right. And I'm sorry, Dennis, you had a public comment card on this. I was so good for every item, and I screwed up at the end.
You know, Dennis Hyman, the MIT Multimedia made a map of the bicycle crashes in the Los Angeles area, and it's interesting to see that the greatest density of the bicycle crashes is located in a very small geographical area, Venice, and then east of Beverly Hills going to downtown. That's indicative of where the greatest amount of bicycling is. As I said before, that's the most difficult place to put bicycle facilities. But there's another study called Medetta Transportation Institute, which focused on putting bicycle facilities together into a network using neighborhood streets, bike paths, and then cycle tracks. But the main emphasis was on residential streets because this was partially written by a civil engineering professor from Boston, which has very little space to put bikeways. So he figured out if you just use residential streets and use a small section of arterials to connect them or the pathways, you can make a network. That's something we should maybe concentrate on to see if we can do that in that area. But it's going to take a little bit of compromising by council members to give up a little space, maybe to get past a freeway, the barriers. But and also, Sharrows can be used. Portland, if you look at Portland, they use it as a directional tool on residential streets. They turn the chevron in the direction you should be going to complete the route. That's a very clever use of it. That's not what it was originally intended for, but so that's another use. That's a very simple thing that we could do. I've noticed there's several residential streets that are very low stress. They have the signals. It's just a matter of giving people direction. Go this way to get where you need to go.
Thank you. I never thought about what chevron meant before, so you just introduced me to something. That wraps it up. We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Hey, Mike.